Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar Exploring the TOPdesk API. My name is Martijn from the Bovenkamp and I'm one of the technical consultants at TOPdesk. Before we continue, I would like to go through some of the basics of this webinar. The duration of this webinar is approximately 30 minutes. The webinar will be recorded, so if you need to leave before the end of the webinar or you want to view the discussed topics, then you can always view the recordings afterwards. You can use the panel on the right-hand side to ask us questions throughout the webinar. My colleagues will be helping you with your questions. Please make sure you collapse the panel on the right if you're not asking questions, as it will cover some of the functionalities being shown in the demo. We'll always follow up via email if we don't have time to answer your question. So if you need to leave before the end of the webinar, we will get back to you. The goals of this webinar are to understand the basic principles of a REST API. We'll also have a look at how to create an application password to authenticate, have a look at some API examples. You'll learn how to use the different API endpoints in TOPdesk yourself, and we'll have a look at what documentation we have available. Let's have a look at the content. We'll start off by looking at the basic principles of a REST API, followed by understanding the TOPdesk API documentation. We'll then move on to a demo, tips and tricks, useful resources, and we'll wrap up this webinar with a summary. Let's first have a look at the basic principles of a REST API. In order to have a better understanding what a REST API is, we're going to imagine that we're a software, an iPhone app developer. We're developing an application which allows the users to take pictures or videos, upload them to a platform and share them with other users. I can also view other pictures and videos on my phone. Now, as an application developer, I want to utilize the camera, speakers, microphone, perhaps some sensors, and let's say the swipe gestures functionality of the phone as well. And wouldn't it be great if, as an app developer, I don't have to worry about these different functionalities, these different endpoints? And that's exactly what we're talking about here. So again, in our example as an application developer, Apple or Android, for instance, they have created endpoints, functions for us to access the camera of the mobile phone, to access the speakers, to access the swipe gestures, etc. And that's great because that means that I can focus on making my application even better. And simply connect to these different endpoints. Now, another benefit of using these API endpoints is that if Apple were to develop a better, faster version of their camera software, that as an app developer, I benefit from that update straight away without breaking my application. So an API, also in TOPdesk, is used for communication between software platforms or services. Now, what is the TOPdesk REST API? Brief overview here. We can see that just as with the iPhone example, we at TOPdesk have different endpoints available as well. There's the general API, which allows us to access the incidents or calls that you have in your system. There's the change management API, asset management API, etc. So different endpoints to achieve different functions in TOPdesk. Now, with these API endpoints comes a lot of documentation as well. What you typically see with a documentation is that it tells you which permissions are required. For instance, can I access the documentation as an operator? And if so, what kind of permissions do I need? Or is it even available to a person, for instance, if I want to leave some feedback on my incident? The documentation always stipulates which HTTP methods it allows. So for instance, a GET or a POST, and it will tell us the URL to access the endpoint. There's also information available regarding the parameters or filter parameters, which allows me to filter the response. And there's typically also examples of the response or example values of what you need to supply or send to the API. And also, very important, there's error code information available as well. So whenever a specific error happens, the documentation specifies what that error typically entails and how to resolve that as well. We're now moving on to the demonstration part of this webinar. There's several topics that I want to cover during this demonstration. So first, we'll have a look at some example endpoints in our documentation. I'll then explain and show you how to create and use an application password to authenticate. And we're going to run through two scenarios that I've created. The first scenario is that we are going to update the status of an existing call via the API. And the second example is that we are moving towards automating a new starter, for instance. So let's say there's a trigger from your HR system that will then create a new change based on a new starter template. And we can also look at an API request that then approves that change. But let's go back a couple of steps and let's have a look at the TOPdesk API documentation first. So our API documentation is of course available on developers.topdesk.com, and we're looking at our most straightforward endpoint here, and that's create an incident. Now there's one thing that you'll probably see straight away, and that's some green lines visible throughout the documentation. What I've done on the right-hand side, and you'll find this function available across the other endpoints as well, is that similar to a different version of TOPdesk itself, our API endpoints, in this case a general API, they have different versions as well. And this is important if you are one of our on-premises customers. So typically our SaaS customers are on the latest version, exceptions are possible, but on the latest version, whereas on premises, if you're hosting TOPdesk yourself, it might be the case that you're on the November release, for instance, or maybe on an even earlier release. So this means it's always important to check which version of TOPdesk you're running and to identify which API version corresponds with that version. Because as you can see here, there are different functionalities available or the lack of functionality in an earlier version compared to the latest version. Now, what we see as well, and I've already mentioned that in the presentation, is that for this specific endpoint, you can see that the documentation stipulates which permission I need. So as an operator, I can access this endpoint with create permissions for first and second line, for instance. But I can also access this endpoint as a person. And there are some restrictions, of course. Only create first line incidents for himself, and only the following fields can be set. But documentation always tells us what is possible. If we scroll down, then we can see the HTTP method used by this endpoint. In this case, that's a post, and we can see the specific URL that we need to fill in order to access this endpoint. Now, the endpoint to create an incident is quite elaborate, and you can see there's a lot of parameters that we can set, caller information, caller lookup, for instance. The list is almost endless, but if we scroll down a bit further, then we can see a request example for an operator. So that means that as an operator, this is what it might look like if I want to raise or kind of create a call via the TOPdesk API. If we scroll a bit further, then you can see the response codes as well. So if my system returns the code 201, that means that the incident has been successfully created and is now in the system. And here we can also see a response from the API. So for instance, with the newly created incident number. If we go down a bit further, then we can see indeed error information. So we've got an error 400, which is a bad request. Could be due to different kind of reasons. There's a 401 unauthorized, which means there's no authentication token provided or no application password provided, or it's expired, for instance. There's a 403 forbidden, which could mean that the permission group that the operator is part of, the API operator, doesn't have permission or not the appropriate permission to execute this action. This was a brief kind of look at the at the documentation. There's different endpoints available, but like I said before in the presentation, they all follow kind of the similar setup and tend to provide you with similar information. The next topic in our demonstration is to have a look at the application password. Now, our documentation stipulates that a token should be used to authenticate. Now, there is indeed a better, more reliable way of authenticating against our different endpoints, and that's the application password. And I'm now going to show you how to create it and where to find it as well. So for this, I need to go to my local TOPdesk environment. And in order to use an application password, I need to set up certain sections in the system first. The first what I need to set up is the permission group. So I've already created a permission group. So if I go to the API general access, and I scroll down, then you'll see under the section reporting API, there's a permission to enable the REST API and to enable the use application passwords. Both of these permissions need to be granted, otherwise you won't have access to the TOPdesk API. On top of these permissions, you'll also need to set what permissions specifically linked to the TOPdesk module the API operator is allowed to access or to execute. So it's not enough just to tick these boxes. You need to specify whether or not this API account can, for instance, read first-line calls, write or create them, or perhaps even read, write, and create second-line calls as well. So bear that in mind when you create your permission group. In addition, operator accounts, when linked to a filter, so for instance, the category filter or the operator filter, are active when you're working with the API as well. So that means that if you're using TOPdesk amongst other departments, let's say HR and facilities, then the filters that you've put in place to, for instance, restrict visibility of HR calls, that restriction is active on the API user as well. After the creation of the permission group, you of course link the permission group with the operator, in this case TOPdesk API, and that gives them access to the TOPdesk API and also the ability to create the application password. So that's your next step. So if you go to the top right and we go to the user settings, then you'll notice that there's a section called application passwords. You can see that I've already created several application passwords as well. And you can also see when they've been last used. If I click on add, then this is where I can create the application password. So let's just write down TOPdesk API webinar. I can define or set when this application password expires, and I'm happy with a year. So I'm going to click on create, and this is now my actual application password. One thing to note is that this application password is only showed once. That's now. So make sure that you save it and you store it on somewhere safe. Okay, so we've now seen how to create an application password. So you need to set up the permission group, need to create an operator, link the operator with the permission group, and logged in as the API operator, generate an application password. Now in TOPdesk, the application passwords need to be hashed. And that's a base 64 encoded hash that we create. So for this example, I've visited a base 64 encoding website, and you can see what I need to fill in and encode that information to generate a base 64 string, and that's the actual string that we use in TOPdesk. Now, of course, this is my test environment. It's a test application password as well, so no harm is being done here. However, I urge you not to use this website when you're using live environments, of course, but you should always use or ask one of your developers to create a little script that generates the base 64 encoded strings for you, rather than sending that across the internet, of course. But base 64 encoded password, the format is as follows. It's the username of your TOPdesk API operator, which you've created yourself, followed by a colon, followed by the full application password that you've just created. Okay, for the next topic, we're going to have a look at the first scenario. So how to update an existing incident in TOPdesk and change the status. So for this exercise, I'm using a tool called Insomnia, which is a REST client, but you can use other tools, of course. Postman is a reliable REST client as well, or perhaps you're familiar with the TOPdesk, with action sequences in TOPdesk, which allows you to perform the HTTP or API request as well. But we're looking at the first scenario. So we're going to update an existing call in TOPdesk, and I've created 3 steps for this. So first, we're going to retrieve the existing call. It's very straightforward. It's API request, and we're going to have a look at how to set that up. So what you can see here is that follow the API documentation. It tells me that, okay, if you want to retrieve the information from a call via the API, then this is the URL that you'll need to use, followed by the incident that you're interested in. So I've done that. Also, the HTTP method used is GET in this case. So now, let's click on send, and you can see that the incident has been retrieved by the system. This response here on the right-hand side, followed by the 200 code, all of that information is documented in our API documentation that we've seen earlier. Now let's deliberately break this request. So we can see I've got my authorization header here. It's defined in the documentation as well. So we've got authorization, followed by the word basic, followed by my base 64 encoded string. And remember, that was my username, followed by colon, followed by the application password. If I were to deactivate this, so now there's no authentication, and I click on send again, then we can indeed see that there's a 401. The request does not contain valid authentication, because of course we can't just access the TOPdesk API without providing valid login credentials. Just going to reinstate the authorization, click on send again, and then you can see that the information has been retrieved. Now what we can see here, this is a JSON in a JSON format, and it tells us what the call looks like. And if we scroll down a bit, then we can see some of the information here about the call. So what we want to do here is that we want to change the status of this call to specific status. However, the TOPdesk API tends to work with IDs, as you can see here, rather than the friendly name that we can all read. It's not necessarily a problem, but it just means that sometimes you need to perform an additional step to get that ID information. This is where we're going to have a look at step number 2, because in order to change the processing status of the call, we need to get the list of the processing statuses that I have available in my local environment. So what I've done is I had a look at the documentation, and the documentation stipulates that you can access or retrieve a list of the processing statuses by going to this specific URL. And again, the method to retrieve information is get. Also, bear in mind that my authorization header needs to be in place as well, otherwise I can't access this information. So let's click on send. And we can see an overview of the different statuses that we have in the system. So let's say for this example, I want to use the status solved. I want to update the call and give it the status solved. So for instance, you've got an external tool which might monitor network activity or issues with specific equipment. That system can contact the TOPdesk API, and whenever there's a disruption in your system, you want to create an incident in TOPdesk, notifying your operators that a server has a malfunction, or maybe one of your network switches is down. But of course, whenever the monitoring tool tells your system that everything is okay again, then TOPdesk needs to be notified as well, of course. So this is where you might want to update the status of a call. So we're taking a note of the ID of the processing status. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to have a look at the third example that I've created, and what you can see here is that I've already filled in some of the information. I'm actually setting 3 fields here, and again, these are specified by the API documentation. So the first field that I want to change is the processing status, and if I want to change the processing status, then I need to specify the ID, and the ID, which you can see here, corresponds with the ID of solved that we've seen in the previous request. Now, what I tend to do as well is that whenever I change something via the API, it tends to be good that we notify the operator that this has been changed by a system account, by the API, for instance. So what I'm doing here as well is that I'm posting an action called status updated by the TOPdesk API, but I don't want the end user to see this information, of course. So what I'm doing is I'm setting another parameter called the action invisible for caller to true. That means that effectively the comment is invisible to the end user, to the caller, of course. So if I click on send, then the system is contacting the TOPdesk API, sending the information across, and it will have updated the status from the status it was previously on to the status solved. And it will also update the TOPdesk call status updated by the TOPdesk API in the progress trail. So what we've seen here, and this is a typical scenario, is that in order to achieve a specific end result, sometimes you need to set up multiple steps. So in this case, we first retrieve a call to see if it exists and what the current status is, for instance. We then get a list of the processing statuses in your environment, and finally we update the status of the call, providing a specific action as well. We're now going to have a look at our second scenario, and this is the change management API. So what we're trying to achieve here is, for instance, imagine that you've got an HR system and new starters are registered there. And what you want to do is that on the back of the registration or the creation of a new starter in that HR system, you want to send across all of that information into TOPdesk and to create a new change. And that change then sets up a specific workflow to, for instance, contact facilities, contact IT, create a mailbox, create a user account, etc. So kind of start the new starter process that you've defined in TOPdesk. Now we can do that via the TOPdesk API. There's several steps that we need to go through. The first step is more as an example, but we want to have a look at the change templates available in our system. So via the API, I can access the applicable change templates. And again, it's a get method that we need to specify. So if I click on send, then you'll see that there's a 200 code is returned, and you can see an overview of the different templates available in my system. So if I scroll down a bit, let's have a look until we see the employee startup, which we have here, followed by the number that we need to have as well. So that's the number that we're going to use in our next request, and that request is to actually create a new change in TOPdesk. So let's have a look there. Now here, there's a bit more information that we need to fill in. And again, remember that you can always use the example request as a starting point, but bear in mind that the IDs used in the system, in this case for the requester, won't correspond with the IDs that you have in your system because we have different users, of course, in our system. But let's talk or have a closer look at the specific action here. So the endpoint that we're accessing here is called operator changes, and bear in mind that it is case sensitive. In this case, the HTTP method is a post, and we're referring to specific to an existing template, and this is the template that we've looked at during the previous request. So this means that for this new change, we don't want to have a one-off change. We actually want to utilize or to use an existing template that we have in our system. And this is where I am specifying that. Now, part of this template are two optional activities. Now, in this case, I want these two activities to be included. So I'm specifically mentioning those two optional activities here so that they're created in my template. Now the requester here, as I said before, this is the ID of Mr. John Dean in the system, and there's several ways you can get that information. I've outside of this webinar, I've created a query to get the information from the persons. Now the other fields that I'm filling here is the brief description, the action, the change type, and more fields here as well as an example. So you can actually determine what information you want to send across together with loading of a template. So let's have a look. If we click on send, then you can see response code is 201. It's been successfully created, and you can see the response as well. And you can see here on the third line, we can actually see the request or the change number of our newly created change. And that's important because I want to use that in my next step. We can also see that the processing status of the change is a request for change. So we've received the change, and we're now in the request for change phase. So all the work can commence, and we can start doing the work in the request for change. Now, my next step was that I wanted to approve the change. So let's say again, the request is received from the HR system, and a different trigger is received from a different system, or maybe from your HR system, that the status can move forward from request for change to approved, and thus kind of leading to the actual extensive change. Now we can use the TOPdesk API for this, and we use again the operator changes endpoint for this. Now this endpoint is slightly different compared to the one that we've seen before. So we're going to have a quick peek at the documentation to see what it is that we need to do exactly. So here we are at the TOPdesk documentation, and you can see if you want to update a change, HTTP method that we need to use is patch. So that's great. We can also see that identifier can be used. It's either the ID or the number of the change to modify. But then there's something slightly different, and that's a JSON list of update steps that we'll need to use. This is where you can see which fields we can use, so request, progress, trail, caller, etc. And if we scroll down a bit, we can actually see how we should create our request by using the example value. One thing to bear in mind as well is that the parameter content type here is different to the one that we typically see. We typically see application/JSON, but this has the -patch plus JSON as well. So that means it's always good to check the documentation and to make sure that you're using the correct content type, because if I make a typo or just have applications/JSON here, it means that it won't work. Now, one hidden kind of option is the model here. It's one of my favorites, as in that it tells you exactly what you need to do. And you can see, okay, in order to update an existing change, there's 4 different values or fields that you can set. So that's the actual operation, which I can expand. So you can see that can be add, remove, replace, move, copy your test. We then have the path. So for instance, progress trail, or if we look here, the updatable fields are progress trail, request, caller, status, etc. We then have the value, so that's a new value of the value that we need to use. And if you're working with the move or copy action, there's a from parameter that you can set as well. So you can see that this this endpoint is slightly different to what we're using to create a new change, for instance, or to update an instance. So that means it's always good to carefully read the documentation. So let's put this into action. Let's go back to our REST client, and I've already created this. And as mentioned before, what I'm trying to achieve here is that I want to change the status from waiting for authorization in the request for change phase, and I want to approve it via the TOPdesk API, and thus actually kicking off the change. I also want to update the progress trail so that any operator knows that this has been updated by a system account, by the TOPdesk API in this case. Before we can continue, I need to paste my my call number, my change number in here. Otherwise, the system has nothing to execute, of course. So let's click on send and see what happens. In this case, you can see that nobody has been returned for a response, but my response was a 204, which means I successfully changed the status of my change. But let's put that to the test. Let's look at my 4th and final request here. I need to change the change number to number 7, and what I'm doing here is I'm accessing the actual change. So I'm just asking TOPdesk, okay, contact or look up this change and retrieve all the information. So if I click on send, then we can see, okay, this is the change that I've created earlier. And if you look closely, we can actually see that the processing status is no longer RFC, but it's extensive, not started. So indeed, my previous request has been successful. So this concludes our demonstration. What we've seen is we took a closer look at the TOPdesk API documentation and how to read, how to use that documentation. We also had a look at how to create and use application passwords. And I talked you through 2 examples that I've created. So the first example or scenario was how to update the status of an existing call via the TOPdesk API. And the second scenario was how to create a new change based on a template, and also how to approve that change via the TOPdesk API. I've created several tips and tricks for when you're working with the TOPdesk API. Like I said before, you can use any tool as long as it supports the creation of API requests to test the API. It can be the TOPdesk API, it can be an external API as well. But what I've seen is that if you use these tools rather than creating the script already, or perhaps using the action sequence, is that these tools make it very easy to connect and to test the API and to quickly see what the response of the API is as well. So that means that whenever you run into an issue, for instance, when you're using the TOPdesk action sequences, it would be a good idea to try and to achieve the same request via the REST client to make sure that there's no error in your code or error in the action sequence that you've created, for instance. One tip is also to read the API documentation carefully and to check out the model. So I showed the model page for the update of the change endpoint, because the example can sometimes be a bit limited, because it only shows one specific scenario, and the model actually tells us which values or which functions are accepted and allowed by the API endpoint. It goes without saying that you should always check the response / execution logs when troubleshooting, and you can use a JSON checker to validate your JSON as well. This is specifically useful when you're using the action sequences, because there's no JSON validator in our action sequences. So if there's a specific error, for instance, the 400 bad request, then it might be good to validate your JSON on online validator, for instance, or copy and paste it to Insomnia to make sure that at least your JSON is correct. Some of the common errors that we see is the 400, which I just explained, is the 404 not found. That could mean that there's a typo or the endpoint that you're trying to access doesn't exist. And there's also 401 unauthorized. If that happens, then it's good to check the permissions of the TOPdesk API user you're using. Are the username and application password correct, or is the application password expired, perhaps? One thing I've seen myself is that there's a specific timeout, I believe around 15 minutes before the permissions are reset. So let's say that you've created a permission group, but you forgot to tick some boxes. It can take up to 15 minutes for TOPdesk to reread the permission group. So if you've got a test environment or on premises, just bear that in mind, that there's some time between the release of that session for the authorization. An overview of the resources available. Of course, we got the developers.topdesk.com available with the TOPdesk API documentation. If my explanation of the application password was a bit too fast, then do not worry. You can go to the tutorial also on the developer's website, and you can read through the steps on how to create an application password yourself. There's also additional webinars available on our YouTube channel. So my colleague William Bolton talked about the TOPdesk API a bit more in detail about what APIs are. So you can have a look at that webinar, or if you're interested in using the TOPdesk API combined with the action sequences, then there's an excellent webinar in our YouTube channel there as well. And you can find the API release notes, and these are very useful because they tell you or us what kind of releases we've released regarding the APIs. So what have we seen? We've seen that the TOPdesk API enables you to communicate with our tool via a standardized interface. We've seen that we can now use application passwords, and that's our recommended way to authenticate. And don't forget that you need to apply the base 64 hash. Use the API documentation to guide you, read it carefully, and you can use a wide spectrum of technology to connect to the TOPdesk API. So this concludes the webinar exploring the TOPdesk API. Thank you very much for your attention.